Will I kick off, Valeri? I'll sort of say, so I'm Jones Irwin. I teach philosophy in Dublin, in the Republic of Ireland. Big thank you to Valeri for organising this event, and my apologies that I haven't been able to attend properly, but I'm in the middle of a sort of an academic term, so it's quite busy here. But have worked a little bit with Valeri before, and I suppose this comes out of an interest in the kind of things he's thinking of as well. I have a long-standing interest in the punk movement. I was involved in the punk movement in Dublin and in England, and I'm interested here today in talking a little bit about how that might relate to aesthetics. So if we think of the notion of a punk poetry, particularly through the work of John Cooper Clarke, who people may be aware of as a poet from Manchester in England, in the north of England. So that'll be the main focus, and I hope we have a bit of time to talk about this. Clarke is someone who emerged. Here's a photograph of the man in his youthful days, although he hasn't changed that much. I met him a couple of years ago. He's in his 70s now. He doesn't look that different from far away. When you get up close, he looks quite different, but he looks similarly from far away, and is still performing in a way that's quite extraordinary, and is currently on a world tour of smaller venues in terms of his work. So he's had a very interesting history. And my hypothesis comes out of an article that I wrote in one of these journals I was talking about to Valeri there, Red Ogre Review, which is a journal in the north of England, which produces work again, which is somewhat alternative. And in that article, I started to think about punk as a phenomenon in terms of its different manifestations here since the late 1970s, and where we, of course, associate it as a music form very much, as an art movement, through film, performance art, or even fiction. But we don't see, or we see an underestimation of the concept or the conceptualization of punk poetry. And this has been very little addressed insofar as here Hannon saying poetry has not been an art form associated with the punk movement. So what I want us to think about then in relation to that, and I suppose this is, if you like, a sub-question within the broader discourse of aesthetics, is first of all, why is punk considered an art form in many other respects, but not in poetry? Secondly, what does this tell us about how poetry is seen as a contemporary art form in the world? And thirdly, how might we rethink and recreate poetry as a practice and as an aesthetic form to engage with punk writings in a contemporary space? So punk certainly understood as an art form, but not in poetry very much. And poetry itself, the conceptualization of poetry, if there is such a thing as such, the boundaries of poetry publication, the boundaries and the criteria of what constitutes what is considered to be legitimate or good poetry or publishable poetry, certainly in the Western world, are very circumscribed, perhaps far more circumscribed than other art forms, often in a seemingly very, very tightly constricted and politicized manner. The only other discourse I can think of in the same fashion is philosophy. So philosophy similarly has this very, very sectarian understanding of itself. Now, it can vary across different sectarian versions, but there are very sectarian versions out there, and similarly with poetry. And so for me, there's that sense of, why is this? Why can poetry not be more democratic? Why can poetry not be more generative? Why can it not reinvent itself more in terms of its relationship, for example, to a movement like punk? What's the problem that's stopping this happening? And can we, in that context, rethink that problem, recreate poetry as a practice and as an aesthetic form to perhaps create more possibilities of genuine engagement here across that divide? Now, one way to think about this is as a political issue, because I think that when we think about punk, we can think about it as a political movement that very much emerges out of similar movements in the 60s and the 70s. So it's liberty, equality, fraternity, but for whom? So this idea that there has been a restriction of these values to a very particular group of people, this realization that rights and equalities are only possessed by an elite, that equality and social justice remain destructive of education and society, and that accordingly there must be some kind of revolution that is bottom-up, democratic. These are ideas which really are the seeds, in a way, of the punk movement that emerges a little bit later on. So by the people, with the people, not for the people. This radical thought leads to a growing social movement that I think we can particularly focus around the events of May 68, which are quite interesting, I think, in terms of what happens, particularly in Paris, in France at that particular time, but obviously has connections across Europe and globally as well. And some of the posters or graffiti art which emerges at this time, I think has almost like a proto-punk version to it. So it's almost like a kind of, I would say, proto-punk. It's like a kind of embryonic punk in terms of what it does, the simplicity of it, the directness of it, the radical politics of it. And some of these posters are kind of a good way in, I think, to Cooper Clarke's poetry. So this one, which is effectively a critique of ideology, on vous intoxique, you are being poisoned, you are being intoxicated, you are being manipulated by all of these ideologies. We look today, we open our computers, we put on our TV screens, we open our phones, and we see this, if we never saw it before, we see it today. So this is very relevant, I think, again, of course, to now. On vous intoxique, beauty's in the street. So this idea again, which will be very connected to the punk movement of bringing things down to the street, but bringing high concepts down to the street. So this sort of movement or mobility between seemingly high concepts like beauty down to kind of the profane level, and the relationship between the sacred and the profane, or the high and the low, being confused or blurred, or this relationship becoming interesting, this relationship becoming creative and dynamic. Youth too often worried about the future, this kind of silencing of people, this silencing of resistance, this passivity, but also this coercion. So we know in terms of the thinkers who kind of emerge at this time, people like Foucault, so on, the discipline and punish, and that idea of coercion, manipulation, the kind of police state, which of course happens in France at this time. So you get this May 68 revolution, and then you get de Gaulle coming back in and kind of reinforcing the status quo. So out of that, then I think you get this, if you like, silencing again, as in this poster, of the youth, of the revolution. The revolution fails. And you can see punk in a way then a few years later as a re-emergence of the same kinds of dynamics, an attempt to kind of reiterate or to regenerate the revolution of 68. And this is where Cooper Clarke becomes interesting, because he is someone who's right at the cusp of this, because he's a little bit older than a lot of the other punks who emerge in 76, 77. He's been working kind of in the clubs of the north of England, and the working class clubs of the north of England, effectively as a comedian or as some kind of performer, in the late 60s, through the kind of hippie movement, and then into this sort of emergence of punk. And it's really that as a sort of a slightly older gent at this stage, that he sort of finds affinity with punk as something that in a way makes more sense to him than what he's come from. And in relation to poetry, he on the one side is kind of a paradoxical figure, because he's seen as a poet laureate of the punk movement, but really almost uniquely in that way as the poet laureate, while remaining then totally outside what's considered to be conventional poetry, or even avant-garde poetry, within poetry circles, certainly in the UK and in Ireland, and even within Europe. So this sort of strange sort of status he has as poet laureate, but that his poetry isn't really poetry. If we think about this from the point of view of what happened in Manchester at that time, I think it's an interesting example of an aesthetic event that sort of emerges from one particular event, one singular event. That was the Sex Pistols coming to Manchester, to the Lesser Free Trade Hall, the punk band, the Sex Pistols, emerging in the summer of 76 and playing a gig in Manchester. And from this one gig, this one short enough gig, emerged a whole series of bands like the Buzzcocks, Joy Division, The Fall, really seminal revolutionary bands that were going to influence a whole generation. We also had fanzines. For example, Linda Sterling was at the gig as well, a designer, a great punk artist. We had great photographers emerging similarly who'd been at the gig. Maybe there were only 30 people at the gig, but they all became somehow seminal artists in different discourses in a multidisciplinary way. We also had the emergence of clubs, such as the Hacienda in Manchester, which was eventually going to go on and become a dance club or a rave club and associated with later generations of counterculture. And so this Northern English vision emerged out of one particular event. Now, that's quite extraordinary, isn't it, in many ways? And again, I think it's something to think about more generally in terms of aesthetics and the relationship between aesthetics and politics and society. And if you think of then Cooper Clarke, who was also at this Sex Pistols gig, Cooper Clarke's poetry then emerges from this as well, because nothing had really happened previous to this. This gig seemed to be, if you like, ex nihilo. And somehow out of that emerges all this proliferation of difference. And the poetry then becomes a kind of a matrix for these sorts of connections. So in the way you get the music and you get the art and you get the film and you get the clubs and the dance, it's almost like the poetry for Cooper Clarke becomes a kind of a matrix of all these different things together. And his way of articulating in verse and in rhyme what other contemporaries expressed through other channels. There's also a kind of a comedy in this, because he is also a kind of a stand-up comedian. He is also a performance poet. Although it's written down, it really emerges more as an oral poetry that is written down. And if anyone has seen him live, you'll see the way his performance is quite extraordinary and is essential really to the actual poetry itself. So again, you know, that sense of performance poetry, which has always been seen as in a suspicious manner by the poetic establishment. And I'll say a little bit about that at the end, where even today, performance poets are seen as not proper poetry. And this, in a way, Cooper Clarke goes back to this suspicion of his work is connected to that. So in his own work, you know, we see different dimensions. This book, one of his early books, 10 Years in an Open Neck Shirt, he hasn't actually written that much. There are only a couple of books available of his work over 30 years. The character Lenny Siberia is left alone with the one thing money can't buy: poverty. So this text itself, which opens the book, is written as a narrative, and although it obeys the prose rather than the verse line, I think we can say that in many ways it's a prose poem. And of course, these are the kind of questions that would be interesting to look at in terms of the definition of his work, or what his work actually does, or how it does it. But certainly this kind of narrative that kicks off this book is very much a prose poem. This famous one from evidently Chickentown, which again became a song, which then became also famous in The Sopranos. The fucking clocks are fucking wrong, the fucking days are fucking long, it fucking gets you fucking down, evidently Chickentown. Anyone who's been in England will know what Cooper Clarke is talking about. I'm sure we can probably relate to it across different countries, but there's something very specifically English about that. About that. And it's again the performativity of that as well. Perhaps some others might say the vulgarity of the critique is all part of Cooper Clarke's aesthetic. But we also have other punk artists, punk poets, punk poetesses like Patti Smith, who says, you know, in times of strife, and we have one at the moment, we have our imagination, we have our creative impulse, which are things that are more important than material things. These are things that we should magnify. So what I want to suggest today is perhaps that, you know, there is something specific and singular about the punk poetic aesthetic that perhaps can help us speak to the contemporary crisis we're in, however we might want to define that, in a way that other particular angles cannot do. Or certainly I think it repays significant attention to give this type of work a renewed attention at the present time, because I think there's something in this that is quite specific, in the same way that May 68 was quite specific, that speaks to today in a way that I think we can really perhaps gain from. So if you want to capture this conception of beauty in the street today, can we do that through something like Cooper Clarke's poetry? Now, one of the things we have to think about here when we ask this question then is, you know, how is this work considered in poetic interpretation? And I just wanted to kind of give an example of that to perhaps situate this question of Cooper Clarke's poetry within how poetry is considered today. And the example I wanted to give was from a recent, very controversial debate that took place in one of the most significant avant-garde journals of poetry in the UK, which is in PN Review. And this was a critique of performance poetry as such. So there are a number of performance poets who have emerged in the UK, especially in the last 5 or 10 years. People like Holly McNish, for example, many of them are female poets. And this poetry has become extremely popular. It's become, it's very critical, but it's also become quite popular. It's quite radical, but it's also become quite popular. But it's also been seen with great suspicion by the poetic establishment. So in this particular review of Holly McNish's work, I think we see some of the sorts of judgments that we might sort of understand as also having excluded Cooper Clarke's poetry from what is considered to be poetry. So I want us to kind of think about this in terms of, I suppose, the specific example of Cooper Clarke, but then also how it might relate to how we understand poetry. So Watts says in relation to Holly McNish that things that may be also perhaps applicable to Cooper Clarke, that, what's wrong with this, why this isn't poetry, is it's a slapdash assembly of words. So it's this sense in which it's not very cultivated, it's very spontaneous, it's very improvisational. Secondly, there's an open denigration of intellectual engagement. So not only is there no intellectual engagement according to Watts, but actually in this kind of performance poetry, there's a kind of an open denigration of intellectual engagement. Okay, this is the claim. The same obviously claim is made about Cooper Clarke's poetry. He doesn't engage intellectually, but not only that, he, if you like, vulgarizes the intellect. And then thirdly, and perhaps this is the most serious critique that's made of it, that it's a rejection of craft. It's a rejection of meter. It's a rejection of, what constitutes, if you like, the structure and the order of harmonious or even disharmonious poetry. And what's interesting about this is that it applies not just to conventional poetry. So it's not as if it's just conventional poetry that's critiquing performance poetry here, but it's actually conventional and avant-garde poetry, which is critiquing performance poetry here. Because avant-garde poetry itself often, and Poetics sees similarly these criticisms to apply to performance poetry and to Cooper Clarke's punk poetry, that this isn't avant-garde. This is just some version of ordinary language, some version of day-to-day vulgar speak that doesn't deserve to be called poetry. So either, from a conventional, traditional perspective, or from an avant-garde experimental perspective, this isn't poetry. So that's one dominant hierarchical interpretation of this. Then on the other hand, we get perhaps a different interpretation, and we could think about that as another alternative here as well. Ben Lerner, who people may have come across, who's an American writer and poet, in his book The Hatred of Poetry, quotes a short text by Marion Moore entitled Poetry, where she says, quote, "I too dislike it. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine." Unquote. So this Marion Moore conception of poetry, as epitomized in this actual titled poem itself reflecting on the very nature of what it's talking about. And in Lerner's very title as well, The Hatred of Poetry, which is actually borrowed from Georges Bataille's book, also The Hatred of Poetry, we see perhaps a different conception of poetry that I would like to suggest today that we might want to defend. A view of poetry that I think is a more generous, but also a more socially accurate horizon for an understanding of what poetry might be, or what it can be, or what various types of multiple writing genres might suitably come under its banner. So I too dislike it. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine. So that's almost like a question. So we have a choice here, it seems to me. We can return to the normal, as the 68ers had it, and it did return to the normal. And in a way, after punk in 76, 77, it returned to the normal again as well. So what if punk poetry was just to be a kind of a momentary distraction to high poetry, and we got this retour à la normale? What if nothing really changes and everything goes back eventually to the poetry status quo, whether that's traditional poetry or avant-garde poetry? And here traditional and avant-garde poetry forming a kind of a union which actually excludes, in this case, performance poetry, punk poetry, vulgar poetry, which isn't really poetry at all. So it's in that context then, to conclude, that I want to bring us back to the questions that I began with. Why is punk considered an art form in many other respects, but not in poetry? Secondly, what does this tell us about how poetry is seen as a contemporary art form? And then thirdly, how might we rethink and recreate poetry as a practice and as an aesthetic form to engage with punk writings in a contemporary space? So those are my questions. You know, that's how I'm kind of concluding, with questions rather than with answers. So thank you for listening. And I might open it up there to get some kind of responses if that's okay. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jones. As always, I have questions and ideas, but I want to offer other people to speak. Ruth, please.
Sure, thank you. I think Ruth's on mute. Oh,
yeah.
hi, Ruth. Yes.
So, hello. Thank you so much for the talk. I would like to hark back what you said at the end of your talk. When you first asked this question, was this only you said a momentary event or something very small that then disappeared? And at the same time, you were saying punk poetry, performance poetry have still not been accepted into the canon, both the avant-garde canon and the more traditional canon. And is this non-acceptance maybe a sign of it still not returning to normalcy? And why should it ever be accepted? So is this, let's say, this continuous expulsion or non-acceptance not what maybe punk poetry is all about? And what's bad about this?
Yes, that's a really good question, Ruth. Yeah, because in many ways, I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad thing that it's expelled, but I find it significant that it's expelled. So perhaps it's that sense of what are the elements within this poetics that make it so reprehensible and so repulsive to either the orthodox or the avant-garde. And that's the, I suppose, the sort of the interesting thing, that it's not just one particular version that's excluding it. It's excluded by the whole spectrum in a way of contemporary poetry. And so you're absolutely right that maybe I gave the impression that what I was trying to do was bring it in, try and bring it home, try and bring it into kind of respectability, which would be a terrible shame in a way, because we'd be kind of killing it off. But in a way that was more like a provocation for me to kind of try and understand what is going on in this dynamic, because it is quite perhaps I wouldn't say it's a unique dynamic, but it does strike me as a very unusual dynamic, the one with poetry. Because, I think if you look at it, for example, in relation to artistic practice, you would not have the same expulsion at all. Like many punk artists have come into, mainstream art, and it's obviously in music, the same applies. You think of grunge and you think of, this kind of mainstreaming of it. And of course, that involves a diminution of it and a dilution down. So as you say very well, it's precisely perhaps because punk poetry hasn't been brought in that way that it retains this kind of singularity that other artistic expressions of punk don't. But so you're right. I think that perhaps that is its strength. but I think also for me, it's that sense of seeking to understand then what that might mean from a contemporary perspective, if one was to practice a kind of a punk poetry. Because in some ways that's what I've tried to do. So for example, you know, in one of my recent works called Ghost Town, which is a chapbook, in effectively I would kind of see that as very much in this kind of tradition of or counter tradition or whatever you want to call it of punk poetry. But I think it's just that sense of what does that mean then? Because if meaning becomes if meaning is almost exclusively owned by the either the orthodox or the avant-garde sectors of poetry, where are we situating this punk poetry? How does one write it? What is it that you're trying to do yourself if you're trying to do it? But I think you're right. There is also that other question as to, should we just leave it out there in the desert and, you know, thriving in its own way? Is there a danger in actually maybe trying to understand that dynamic that we might domesticate it a bit?
No, I particularly like that the differences you emphasize between poetry on the one hand and music and visual arts on the other hand, because there, I mean, integration took place, as you rightly said. So
yes.
There's something peculiar about poetry, but I cannot but say I like it.
Yes, yeah, it's exactly that. It's that this is also what draws me to it, this peculiarity of this relationship. Now, I think it also has to do with poetry. So on one side, it has to do with what punk poetry is trying to do. On the other side, it perhaps has to do with the very specific nature of how poetry defines itself. You know, that's obviously quite a differentiated thing in itself. But perhaps the sense in which poetry is more of a high art and sees itself more as a high art than perhaps, for example, fiction does, perhaps than does music does. And is that also part of this history? Because there's a genealogy here that we can look at, which itself is interesting. Thank you, Ruth. A really good question.
Jones, very quickly, do you distinguish between poetry and poetics?
Yeah, so I think poetry for me is the actual writing of poems, or the articulation of poems as poems. Poetics is the meta level of that, where there's a standing back from the individual poems or the selections of poems, and seeking to, if you like, to some degree relate that to an understanding of what is being done. But there's a relationship clearly between the two, and there's an interdependency between the two. And I think that relationship in punk is interestingly different perhaps from others, because I think that because of these things we're talking about in punk poetry that are intransigent or recalcitrant to being domesticated, that in a way punk poetics has more of a problem than other kinds of poetics because of this subversive quality of the actual poetry itself. So I think the relationship between poetry and poetics and punk is quite singular, and I haven't really worked that out yet. But I think it's a good question. They're different from each other. I don't know if that answers your question, but I see poetics as in principle at the more meta level, but it's in that relationship to the actual practice of the poetry itself. But punk poetics seems to me to be something that hasn't really ever been developed. Cooper Clarke doesn't write about his own poetry, for example. Jim Carroll doesn't write about his own poetry. Patti Smith maybe would be an example, but she writes about it in relation to her music as well, so it's slightly different. But there's nearly an absence of punk poetics, even if we do have some punk poetry.
So if we were to return to the schism in Plato between poetry and philosophy, poetics has these philosophical elements about it, the critical meta element.
I think so, although, clearly in Plato you have this contradiction as well, that in many ways Plato is a poet, you have the, it's at the very beginning. I've always seen Plato as a kind of a proto-punk as well. You know, that the dialogue is really, you know, putting everything into motion. It puts everything into this sort of spatial situation. So I think that yes, I think certainly the expulsion of the poets from the Republic, is that a bit like the expulsion of the punks from poetry? I'm not sure, but we could think about that as an analogy. Thank you.
I would consider Diogenes the dog to be the first punk and performer, artistic performer.
Yeah, I probably see Heraclitus maybe, but Diogenes as definitely a follower of Heraclitus. Yeah. Thanks, Valerie.
Monica, please.
Hello everyone, and thank you, Jones, for this very provocating talk. I would like to mention that I think that it's very important to respect what subversive expressions are, and maybe sometimes it's us, not only philosophers or art critics or the public in a broad sense, that we don't escape our canonic sensibility or canonic values. And I think it's a very important challenge for philosophers and for teachers, aesthetic teachers, aesthetic educators in a very wide sense, to become non-canonic and to form this sensibility to be more free and more to escape its own limitations. And it's really, really very interesting. Maybe we should be less domesticated rather than bringing to the institutions whatever happens around us. Maybe it's a fault of our, or it's a limitation of our own way of interacting to the world. And I think all this is very, very interesting for this. Thank you very much, Jones.
Thanks, Monica. No, I agree, but I think also then there's this difficulty, as Ruth said, that if you start bringing it in, that there's a danger that you end up domesticating the very thing that you're trying to sort of give recognition to. And so I think there's a whole question here of recognition as well. And I think one of the interesting things about punk and punk poetry is that it doesn't seek recognition. It actually rejects any desire for recognition within the canon. And so I think that this is another singular aspect of it. In a way, it's quite different from a lot of our current discourses, you know, of various sorts, which say we want to be recognized, we want to come into the canon. Punk says, no, we don't want anything to do with that. We're nihilists, you know. And so I think this is something itself quite singular. But I think also then, you know, and I'm just thinking of the contemporary moment we're in and the crisis of it politically and existentially and artistically then as well. Is there a way we can think about what happens here that might actually help us to rethink some of the things that are happening in our world at the moment without domesticating punk poetry, but actually perhaps recreating it for today, for 2023 and onwards?
Yes, I love this idea of rethinking and recreating. Thank you very much, Jones.
Thanks, Monica. Thank you, everybody.